In the hush of twilight, where the pines clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers, Elias and Eliza Smith arrived at the edge of the old forest. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a perfume that whispered of secrets long buried beneath the roots. They had driven for hours, the road narrowing until it was little more than a scar through the wilderness, their battered truck rattling over roots that seemed to twist upward in protest. Elias gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white, while Eliza stared out the window, her reflection in the glass a perfect echo of his own, same sharp cheekbones, same stormy grey eyes, same unruly dark hair that fell in waves. Twins, they were, bound by more than blood, a connection that had deepened into something the world would call monstrous. The cabin loomed ahead, a squat shadow against the encroaching night, its weathered boards groaning softly in the wind as if breathing. They had found it listed in a forgotten corner of an online map, a place untouched by cell signals or prying eyes, perfect for their new life. Elias killed the engine, and silence rushed in like a flood, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. "This is it," he murmured, his voice low, laced with a thrill that bordered on fear. Eliza turned to him, her hand finding his, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that sent shivers down his spine. "Our beginning," she replied, her smile a mirror of his own, though something flickered in her eyes, a shadow, perhaps, or just the dimming light. They unloaded their meager belongings under the watchful gaze of the trees, the forest pressing close, its branches rustling like hushed conversations. Inside, the cabin was a relic of forgotten lives, dust-laden furniture, a stone fireplace cold as a grave, and walls etched with faint scratches that might have been marks from claws or desperate nails. As night fell fully, wrapping the world in inky blackness, they lit a fire, the flames dancing shadows across their faces. Elias pulled Eliza close, their bodies fitting together like puzzle pieces forged in the same fire. "No one will find us here," he whispered against her hair. But even as the words left his lips, a faint sound drifted from the woods, a murmur, low and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind, calling names that sounded eerily like their own. The fire crackled, popping sparks into the air, and Eliza stiffened in his arms. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. Elias listened, heart pounding, but the night had gone still again, the silence thicker than before, pregnant with unspoken dread. They dismissed it as imagination, the creak of settling wood or the sigh of the forest settling into sleep. Yet as they lay together in the narrow bed upstairs, the darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing, the whispers returned, soft, insistent, weaving through the cracks in the walls. "Elias! Eliza!" they seemed to say, a chorus of echoes that twisted into laughter, or perhaps sobs. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of mirrored faces staring back from the trees, and in the morning, the woods seemed closer, the path back to the road obscured by mist that clung like regret. What they didn't know, what they couldn't yet fathom, was that the forest held more than shadows. It cradled a mystery born of their own forbidden union, a haunting that would unravel the very threads of who they were. The village of Hollow's End sat cupped in a narrow valley where the mountains pressed so close that sunlight only ever reached the church steeple for a few hours each day. It was the kind of place people were born into and rarely left, where every face carried the same weathered lines and every surname repeated itself like an echo. In the winter of 1987, Margaret Smith gave birth to twins in the back room of the old farmhouse on the eastern ridge, a birth attended only by her husband and the midwife who had delivered half the valley. The boy came first, red-faced and furious, followed 2 minutes later by a girl so quiet the midwife feared she hadn't survived the journey. When the infants were laid side by side on the quilt, their tiny fists found each other instantly, fingers locking as if they had never been separate. From that first moment the bond was unnatural, or at least that's what the older women muttered while shelling peas on porches. Elias and Eliza never cried at the same time. When one wailed the other fell silent, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. They learned to walk holding hands, stumbling together like a single four-legged creature. Their mother dressed them in matching clothes long past the age when most parents stopped, partly because it was easier and partly because separating them felt wrong, like tearing a page out of a book. At night they refused separate beds, curling into one another beneath the same blanket, breathing in perfect rhythm, as though a single heart had been split between two chests and was trying desperately to reunite. By the time they started school, the whispers had grown teeth. Children dared one another to pull the twins apart during recess, only to watch Elias shove or Eliza bite with a ferocity that left bruises shaped like small half-moons. Teachers noticed how they finished each other's sentences, how they turned in identical homework written in mirrored handwriting, how they grew pale and listless if kept in different rooms for too long. The village preacher once tried to speak to their father about the sin of pride in making them so alike, but Thomas Smith only stared until the man found an excuse to leave. In Hollow's End, people learned quickly not to come between the twins. As they grew taller, the resemblance sharpened into something almost uncanny: same height, same slender build, same storm-grey eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than their years. They moved through the pine-shadowed lanes like matched ghosts, speaking softly to one another in a language of glances and half-smiles no one else could translate. The village watched, uneasy, waiting for the day the bond would twist into something darker, the way a river looks calm until it reaches the drop. The summer they turned 23, the air in Hollow's End turned thick with heat and suspicion. Elias had taken work at the lumber mill, coming home each evening with pine sap on his forearms and sawdust clinging to his dark hair like pale snow. Eliza waited for him on the porch swing, barefoot, her dress the same faded blue as his work shirt, as if she dressed to match the man she couldn't bear to be apart from for 8 hours. When he stepped onto the gravel, she rose without a word and walked into his arms. They stood there swaying slightly, foreheads touching, breathing each other in while the cicadas screamed in the trees. That was the summer the glances stopped being subtle. Old women crossed themselves when the twins passed. The new preacher spoke of Sodom in his sermons and looked directly at the Smith family pew, though Margaret and Thomas had long since quit attending. Someone left a lamb's heart nailed to their gate one dawn, still dripping. Elias pried it free with shaking hands while Eliza watched from the window, her face unreadable. They began meeting after midnight in the hayloft, climbing the ladder one after the other, moving by moonlight that painted silver across their identical collarbones. Words came slowly at first, whispers against skin, confessions that tasted like rust and honey. They had always known this current ran beneath their closeness, a river too wide to leap and too deep to wade. One night Elias traced the curve of Eliza's jaw and said, "If loving you is wrong, then I don't want the world's right." She answered by kissing him so hard their teeth clicked, sealing something neither could name. 3 weeks later, under a sky bruised purple by thunderheads, they drove to the ruined chapel on the far side of the ridge, stone walls collapsed inward like broken ribs, ivy choking the altar. Elias wore his father's only suit, too short in the sleeves. Eliza had sewn herself a dress from their mother's wedding gown, cutting it down until it fit her exactly. They spoke vows they wrote on the back of a gas station receipt, promising forever in shaking voices while lightning flickered through the empty windows. When Elias slipped the plain gold band onto Eliza's finger, bought with 6 months of mill wages, their hands trembled so violently the ring nearly slipped to the ground. They kissed among the ruins, tasting rain and each other, and for one bright moment believed distance and secrecy could keep them safe. They packed that same night, throwing clothes into duffel bags while their parents slept down the hall, leaving a note that said only "We're sorry and we have to." By dawn the truck was pointed north, toward the deep woods where no roads were named and no questions were asked, the chapel's echo of "I do" still ringing in their ears like a warning bell neither of them heeded. The road ended where the forest decided it should. After 3 hours of switchbacks and gravel that pinged against the undercarriage like buckshot, the truck's headlights caught a rusted chain stretched across 2 pine trunks. Elias killed the engine and the sudden silence felt physical, pressing against their eardrums. Beyond the chain, a narrow track disappeared into blackness so complete it looked solid. He and Eliza climbed out, boots crunching on frost-tipped needles, and stood shoulder to shoulder breathing the same breath, cold, resinous, alive with something older than names. They unloaded by flashlight, 2 duffels, a box of canned food, the iron skillet their mother had used for 30 years, the quilt from their childhood bed still smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. Elias cut the chain with bolt cutters bought for this exact moment. The links parted with a dull metallic sigh that echoed too long among the trunks. Then they drove forward, tires sinking into centuries of fallen needles, the truck lurching like a wounded thing until the track finally widened into a clearing no map acknowledged. The cabin waited at the far edge, half swallowed by shadow. It was smaller than the photographs, a single-story rectangle of hand-hewn logs gone silver with age, roof sagging under a beard of moss. Vines thick as wrists had pried apart the chinking and curled inside the windows like they were searching for warmth. A stone chimney leaned slightly, as though the house had tried to walk away once and thought better of it. When Elias pushed the door, it opened with a sound like a throat clearing after decades of silence. Inside, the air tasted of mouse nests and wet earth. Their flashlight beams slid across a table scarred by axes, a pot-bellied stove furred with rust, shelves where jars of unidentifiable preserves had burst and dried into amber stalactites. Up a narrow staircase, one room with a single iron bed frame and a window that looked straight into the face of a hemlock so close its branches scraped the glass when the wind turned. Eliza set the quilt on the bare mattress and ran her palm across it, as if smoothing the years they had stolen. Outside, the forest closed the circle. Pines rose straight and branchless for 50 feet before exploding into green darkness overhead, blotting out the sky until only a jagged hole remained, through which a few stars glared down like suspicious eyes. No bird called. No insect droned. Only the soft, constant rustle of needles high above, a sound like distant surf or many voices murmuring at once. Elias stepped off the porch and the ground gave slightly under his weight, spongy with centuries of decay. When he looked back, Eliza stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, her silhouette framed by the weak glow of the lantern behind her. The trees leaned in, patient, ancient, already learning the shape of their new tenants. Night came down hard, the way it does when there is no moon and the sky is only a lid slammed shut. They had eaten from the same tin plate, beans and salt pork heated over a fire that refused to throw more than a sullen red glow, and then climbed the stairs together, boots creaking on warped boards that remembered no other weight. The iron bed accepted them without protest. They undressed in the dark, familiar with every scar and freckle on the other's body the way a blind man knows the face of his beloved, and slipped beneath the quilt that still carried the faint scent of their childhood bedroom. Sleep came in shallow waves. Elias drifted first, lulled by the steady drum of Eliza's heart against his ribs, the way it always had been. Then the hush changed. It was subtle, like a held breath released. A murmur rose outside the cabin, not wind, not branches, but something shaped like language. Elias opened his eyes to total darkness and felt Eliza stiffen beside him. The sound grew clearer, threading through the log walls as easily as smoke. Elias. Eliza. The names were spoken softly, almost tenderly, by voices that belonged to neither of them yet carried the exact timbre of their own. They came from every direction at once, from the trees, from the ground, from the air itself. Sometimes a single voice, sometimes two in perfect unison, the way the twins spoke when they finished each other's thoughts. Elias sat up, the quilt sliding to his waist, and reached for the lantern on the floorboards. His hand closed on cold iron, but he did not strike a match. He was afraid the light would show him who, or what, was calling. Eliza pressed closer, her skin fever-warm. "They know our names," she whispered against his shoulder. The voices answered immediately, as though they had been waiting for permission. "Come out, come back, we've been waiting." The words were gentle, coaxing, the way their mother once called them in from the rain when they were small. But beneath the sweetness lay something else, a hunger that made the hairs rise along Elias's arms. He felt the mattress shift as Eliza turned toward the window. Outside, the darkness was absolute, yet the glass reflected nothing, no stars, no lantern glow, only a deeper black that seemed to pulse. The voices rose and fell in a rhythm that matched their breathing, in and out, until Elias could not tell where his lungs ended and the night began. They lay rigid, listening as the whispers circled the cabin like wolves that had learned to speak. Dawn arrived thin and reluctant, a grey seepage through the needles that never quite became daylight. Elias woke first, his mouth tasting of iron and smoke. The whispers had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving only the ordinary sounds of the forest, a single crow complaining overhead, the soft drip of condensation from the eaves. Yet the silence that followed the voices felt worse, like the hush after a scream. He slipped from the bed without waking Eliza and pulled on yesterday's clothes, the fabric stiff with cold. Downstairs he rebuilt the fire, moving quietly, but every stick he laid seemed to crack louder than gunfire. When the flames caught, he stood at the window staring out at the wall of trunks. Nothing moved. The clearing looked exactly as it had the day before, yet everything felt rearranged, as though the trees had shifted positions in the night to watch the cabin more closely. Eliza came down wrapped in the quilt, her bare feet silent on the stairs. She said nothing, only stood behind him and rested her cheek between his shoulder blades. They stayed like that until the kettle began its low whistle. Outside, the light strengthened just enough to show the frost glittering on the needles like broken glass. Elias took the axe from beside the door and walked into the woods alone. He told himself it was for firewood, but the moment his boots crossed the invisible line where the clearing ended, the whispers returned, no longer outside the cabin, but inside his skull. They were softer now, almost conversational, threading through his thoughts like ivy through cracked stone. Closer, just a little farther, you'll see. He followed without deciding to, the axe hanging loose at his side. The ground rose gently, then steeper, roots snaking across the path like veins. The voices guided him left, then right, always ahead, always promising. Sunlight never reached here, the canopy was too thick, the air green and underwater. After 20 minutes the trees parted around a small hollow he had never noticed before, though he felt certain he had walked this way yesterday. At its center lay a patch of earth darker than the rest, perfectly circular, about the size of a grave. No moss grew there. No needles had fallen. Only bare soil, black and moist, exhaling a faint warmth he could feel through the soles of his boots. The whispers gathered into a single voice, his own voice, but older, tired, patient. Dig. That same afternoon the sky sealed itself with low cloud, the color of old pewter. Eliza napped fitfully on the iron bed while Elias chopped wood outside, each swing of the axe a small defiance against the morning's discovery. He had not dug, the word had lodged in his throat like a fishbone, and he had backed away from the dark circle until the trees hid it again. When he returned, arms full of split pine, Eliza was sitting upright, eyes wide and unseeing, the quilt clutched to her chest. She did not answer when he spoke her name. Her lips moved, forming soundless words, and her pupils were blown so wide the grey irises had almost vanished. Elias dropped the logs and went to her. Only when he touched her wrist did she blink, once, slowly, as if surfacing from deep water. I saw us, she said, voice raw. Both of us. But wrong. The dream had come in fragments that refused to stay separate. She was walking the forest floor barefoot, yet the needles did not prick her. Ahead, a figure waited beneath the hemlocks, tall, dark-haired, dressed in the same white nightgown she wore now. When she drew close, the figure turned, and Eliza saw her own face staring back, but the eyes were hollow, black pits leaking slow tears of sap. The shadow Eliza smiled with too many teeth and reached out, palm up, revealing a wedding ring buried in the flesh like it had grown there. Then the figure split down the middle with a wet tearing sound, and inside was Elias, curled fetal, skin pale as birch, eyes sewn shut with pine needles. In the dream she tried to scream, but roots burst from the ground and wrapped her ankles, dragging her down until the forest floor closed over her head. Beneath the soil she was still walking, still chasing the shadow self that wore her face and his heart. The darkness pulsed like a womb, and every beat whispered the same thing, you were never two. She woke gasping, the taste of earth in her mouth though she had not left the bed. Elias held her while she shook, but even his arms felt strange now, too familiar, as though she were being embraced by her own reflection. When she finally looked at him, really looked, she saw the faint ring of bruised skin around his left eye, a perfect mirror of the faint bruise blooming beneath her own right eye, marks neither of them remembered earning. Rain began that evening, a cold, steady hiss against the roof that made the cabin feel smaller, as though the walls were inching inward. Elias carried the lantern to the narrow shelf beneath the stairs where the previous tenant had left a jumble of forgotten things, rusted traps, a cracked mason jar of nails, a child's wooden top painted faded red. Behind the jar his fingers brushed something softer, leather cracked with age, pages swollen from damp. He drew it out carefully, as if it might bite. The diary was small, bound in dark calfskin, its cover stamped with the initials MS in lettering so worn they looked like scars. When he opened it, the spine sighed and released a puff of dust that smelled of mildew and iron. The first pages were stuck together. He separated them with a fingernail and felt Eliza come to stand behind him, her breath warm against his ear. The handwriting was spidery, frantic, ink-browned to the color of dried blood. It began in 1923. A woman named Miriam Smith, their great-aunt, though they had never heard her name spoken, wrote of giving birth to twins in this very cabin during a February storm that buried the trail for weeks. The boy lived only hours, the girl survived. Miriam claimed the forest took the dead child and kept something in exchange. Night after night she heard 2 infant cries though only one cradle rocked. She wrote of seeing small footprints leading away from the cabin and returning doubled, of finding pine needles woven into the living baby's hair like tiny stitches. Later entries grew wilder. Miriam described a bargain made in desperation: 1 twin returned for 1 twin surrendered, a cycle the woods demanded every generation. She drew crude sketches of a clearing where the earth stayed black and warm, ringed by hemlocks whose trunks bore twin sets of initials carved deep, E and E, over and over, decades apart, the bark grown around the letters like lips closing on a secret. The final pages were smeared, the words barely legible. They wear our faces now. They wait beneath. When the new twins come, the debt is paid again. Eliza turned the last page and found a single dark hair pressed between the paper, long and straight, the exact shade and texture of their own. The rain thickened overnight, turning the clearing into a shallow bowl of water that reflected nothing but low cloud. Elias woke before dawn with the taste of sap in his mouth and the diary's words crawling behind his eyes like insects. He did not wake Eliza. Instead he pulled on his coat, took the lantern though the dark was already thinning, and walked back into the trees as if dragged by a line hooked through his ribs. The voices welcomed him immediately, no longer pleading but satisfied, almost proud. They guided him along a route he had never noticed before, a faint depression in the needles that ran straight as a plumb line through the undergrowth. Water soaked his cuffs and wickered up the legs of his jeans, but he felt no cold. After what might have been minutes or an hour, the trees parted again, revealing the same hollow he had found yesterday, only now the black circle had become a perfect clearing, 30 feet across, ringed by trunks so straight and close they formed a living wall. In the center lay objects arranged with impossible care. A child's shoe, small and red, the leather cracked but the color still bright. Beside it a matching one, its twin. A wooden top, painted faded red, the same one that had sat beneath the stairs. A scrap of quilt, their quilt, torn into a perfect square and weighted at each corner with pine cones. A photograph, edges curled, showing 2 dark-haired children standing hand in front of this very cabin, their faces scratched out with something sharp. Elias knelt, knees sinking into the soft earth, and saw that every item had once belonged to them, pieces lost or discarded years ago in Hollow's End. A marble Eliza had cried over at age 7, the ribbon Elias wore the day he started school, the tiny silver spoon their mother swore had vanished the week they were born. The objects were arranged in a spiral that ended at the exact spot where the soil steamed faintly, exhaling a breath that smelled of turned earth and warm milk. Footprints ringed the spiral, small bare feet, perfectly matched pairs, some pressed deep, some barely dimpling the surface, all leading inward and then outward again, as though something had walked the path many times, rehearsing. When Elias reached out to touch the red shoe, the voices sighed in unison, a sound like wind through many throats. The earth beneath the objects pulsed once, gently, the way a throat swallows. The storm arrived at dusk on the 3rd day, a wall of black cloud that rolled over the ridge like a living thing. Wind tore at the cabin's shingles and hurled fistfuls of needles against the windows until the glass bowed inward. Inside, the fire guttered and flared each time the chimney inhaled. Elias and Eliza sat on opposite sides of the table, the diary open between them like a dead bird, neither able to look away from the smeared final page. Lightning struck close enough to bleach the room white. In that instant the walls vanished and they were somewhere else entirely, a narrow bedroom in the old farmhouse, wallpaper peeling in yellow strips, the air thick with blood and camphor. Their mother lay on the bed screaming through clenched teeth while the midwife bent between her knees. Thomas Smith stood at the footboard, face grey, repeating the same useless prayer. Then the first child crowned, dark hair slick with birth, and the midwife's voice cracked with something like fear. Another flash, and the scene shifted. Now the room was empty except for 2 cradles side by side. In one lay a boy, blue and still. In the other a girl wailed, fists beating the air. Their mother, pale as the sheets, reached for the living child and found her arms full of both, warm and cold together, the dead twin cradled against the living one's chest as though they had never been separated. The midwife tried to take the corpse away, but Margaret Smith snarled like an animal and would not let go. Outside the window, the pines bent almost double in a wind that had no business blowing in July. A third flash. The cradles were gone. Only the midwife remained, older now, standing in the ruined chapel where Elias and Eliza had spoken their vows. She held a bundle wrapped in the same quilt that now lay on their cabin bed. One taken, one returned, she whispered to the empty air. The woods keep the bargain. Then she looked straight at Elias and Eliza, through decades, through the storm, and her eyes were hollow, black, leaking sap. Thunder followed so hard the cabin shook on its stones. When the darkness rushed back in, Elias was on his knees, palms pressed to his temples, blood trickling from one nostril. Eliza stared at him with the same slow drip sliding from her own nose, perfect mirror. They understood then that the memory had never been buried, it had only been waiting for them to come close enough to hear it breathe. The storm lasted 3 days and 3 nights without pause, as though the sky had decided to drown the world and start over. Water seeped between the logs, ran in thin brown rivers across the floorboards, and dripped from the ceiling in a steady, maddening rhythm that matched their heartbeats. They burned every stick of furniture to stay warm, the table first, then the chairs, finally the shelves, feeding the stove until its belly glowed dull red and the air inside shimmered with heat and wet wool. Outside, the clearing had become a lake. The trees stood ankle-deep in black water that reflected nothing. On the second night the voices stopped whispering and began to speak plainly, words sliding through the cracks like fingers. They named the thing that lived beneath the clearing, older than the mountains, patient as stone, hungry the way a grave is hungry. It had tasted Smith blood before, Miriam's boy, the twins before them, the twins before those, each pair drawn here by the same invisible thread, each pair believing escape was possible. The marriage had been the key in the lock. The moment ring met finger, the bargain reopened and the debt came due again. Eliza felt it first in her belly, a cold knot tightening with every thunderclap, as though something inside her were being rewound. She pressed both hands low and looked at Elias with eyes suddenly ancient. "It wants the space between us," she said. "The place where we stop and it begins." Elias tried to laugh, but the sound came out wet. He had begun bleeding from the ears in thin dark lines that tasted of pine sap. By the third dawn the stove was cold iron and the rain had softened to a hiss. They stood at the window watching the water recede, leaving the clearing scarred and steaming. In its center the black circle had grown, spreading outward in a perfect ring that swallowed the spiral of childhood relics whole. The earth there moved, slowly, deliberately, like a mouth tasting the air. From its depths rose a smell neither of them could name yet both recognized, the copper milk scent of a womb that has decided what it will birth. Eliza took Elias's hand and placed it over the cold knot beneath her ribs. Beneath the skin something shifted, answering. The rain finally stopped on the 4th morning, leaving the world rinsed and silent. Elias and Eliza walked out of the ruined cabin barefoot, the quilt wrapped around both of them like a single skin. They moved as one creature, 4 legs keeping the same slow rhythm, toward the clearing that now yawned wide and waiting. The black circle had become a perfect oval, its edges crisp as a wound, and the soil inside it breathed in long, deliberate pulses. They stepped over the rim together and the ground accepted their weight without sound. Warmth rose through their souls, familiar, almost maternal. The voices were no longer outside, they spoke from within their own mouths, soft and overlapping, the way they had spoken to each other since childhood. You were never two. Never separate. Only borrowed. Only lent. Memory unfolded like a flower forced open by frost. They saw the dead twin lifted from the cradle in 1987, saw the midwife carry the small blue body into these same woods while their mother screamed until her throat tore. They watched the forest take the corpse and press something back into the living child's chest, something that looked like a heart but beat with the slow patience of roots. They understood now that the surviving infant had carried both souls from that moment, split and uneasy, waiting for the body to grow large enough to divide again. The marriage had been the division. The rings, the vows, the consummation under the stormlit sky, each act a knife cutting the single soul in half so the woods could reclaim what belonged to them. Elias felt himself thinning, his outline blurring at the edges, while Eliza's grew sharper, more solid, as though she were drinking him through the places their skin still touched. They knelt in the warm earth. Their reflections looked up from the wet soil, not from above, but from below, two pale faces gazing out of the darkness with calm, identical smiles. The reflections reached up with hands that were their hands, and Elias and Eliza reached down with the same motion, fingers meeting fingers through the membrane of the world. There was no pain, only a long, slow exhalation, as though they had been holding one breath since the night they were born. The quilt slipped from their shoulders and lay empty on the ground. The clearing closed over them like water over a dropped stone, leaving no ripple, no scar. Only the rings remained, two thin circles of gold half buried in black soil, already greening with new moss. Far away, in Hollow's End, a woman would one day give birth to twins again. The Woods were patient. The debt was never paid, it was only passed along.